I've had some pretty interesting encounters in my life. Some tell me that it's my magnetic personality that draws chaos. Others say God likes messing with me to see how I'd act. But I think life is chock full of serendipitous scenarios, and some of us shut them down and try to control the situation, and then there are others who are comfortable letting life lead them. Me, I fall into the latter category, and I'd like to tell you a story that'll keep in my heart forever. Let's set the scene here. I'm a 22-year-old kid at this point, living in a tiny little town in southern Oregon. This isn't a tiny town like what you'd find in California either, where you can drive a few miles to a fun city. It's more of a retirement town with nothing to do and no escaping the boredom. Don't get me wrong, if you're the outdoorsy type, then you don't have a problem. You could go hunting and fishing, play airsoft with your friends, but the bar life is pretty dull and the city shuts down around 10 o'clock. And I lived in this city my whole life. I never thought to consider that this could be causing the mental anguish that I've been going through. I didn't feel like myself. Nothing I did made me happy. I often felt stuck and alone, caught somewhere in the middle of without purpose and the idea that I'd die here, old and alone one day. I spoke to a friend about how I was feeling, and he recommended me a therapist. He said that she was very wise and had given him a lot of good advice, but for me it was her negotiable price that had me interested. I went to Benita twice, giving her stories from my life and letting her see for herself what kind of person I am. It was during that second meeting when she looked me in the eyes and told me that she knew what was wrong and how I could fix it. She said, "I can see that you're an adventurous person. Novelty and experience energizes you, and you can't cage someone with a spirit like that." She recommended I take a vacation, go somewhere exotic, or at the very least leave my home state and see America. I thought about this the whole way home. They say the law of attraction is powerful. You think about positive things and positive things happen. You think negatively and you know the rest. But it never became so obvious to me until that night. I was having a party with a few friends. We were drinking, smoking Oregon's finest, when two of my friends who were in a relationship together told me that they'd be going to visit Vietnam soon. They told me about all the wonderful experiences that they'd had there, as they'd lived there for 2 years and were very eager to return. I told them that I very much wanted to go, and this was a decision that changed my life forever. Now, let's fast forward through the waiting, preparation, and 14-hour plane flight. I don't need to tell you how annoying airports are, but if you can help it, never lay over in China. Those pricks will steal everything from you, and they'll even yell at you for resting your feet up on your luggage. Freaking communists, but either way, we finally make it to Vietnam, and when I initially exited the airport, I almost passed out. I'd never felt such intense heat in my life. Not only was it hot, but it was more humid than anything I'd ever experienced before. I wondered how I could get used to this, and it was 2 in the morning when we arrived. We got to a hotel and crashed for the night, and a week or so later we got an apartment, so we could stay for a month and a half without having to move around. This is when I started dabbling on Tinder. See, one thing I realized very quickly was my white skin was like gold to the women in Vietnam. No matter who I swiped on Tinder, I always got a match. This was new and very exciting for me. I went on dates as much as I could, had some of the finest food with the finest women, and I felt as though nothing was off limits to me. One day I got on Tinder. I was swiping along when I came across this girl named Alia. She seemed so different from all the other Vietnamese girls that I'd been swiping through. She wore Western clothes, her sense of style was tiers above everyone else, the tips of her hair were dyed purple or red depending on the photo, and the pictures she took were taken so artistically. They were composed so well. I knew I wanted to match with her, so I swiped right. A few minutes later I got a notification for a match. No surprise there, I thought, this is Vietnam after all. As I got to talking with her though, I realized that she'd never actually used Tinder before. She'd never swiped on anybody. She initially got the app because she wanted to see how it worked. She'd been thinking about designing a fashion app and had been downloading popular apps to get some ideas. I asked her why she decided to swipe right on me, and she told me that when she was a very young girl, she had a dream that she would meet someone with the name Alan, which happened to be my middle name. She said that he would be important somehow. She also told me that she liked that I was into tech and that I dyed my hair purple, which I'd done about a year before, but I'd kept that photo on my Tinder profile. Talking to Ailey was nice. She watched a lot of English shows when she was a kid and she worked as a translator, so our conversations flowed very well, and I knew I wanted to meet her. She told me that she didn't download Tinder to meet guys and had no interest in going on dates. She thought that maybe we could be friends, but being the American I am, I wanted more than that. So she devised a challenge for me. She said that if I could find her somehow, somewhere in the city, she would allow me to take her on a date. Now, I was living in Ho Chi Minh City at the time. This place alone has over 8 million people living in it, or at least when I was there it did. How in the world am I expected to do this, I thought to myself, but I gave her my Instagram information so we could keep in touch. She deleted Tinder, and for the next few days, I walked around Vietnam. I explored the city and let myself get as lost as I possibly could. There was something freeing about being completely alone in a city this big, nowhere to go and accidentally discovering things that I never thought I'd see or ending up in little adventures that I'd never asked for. Later in the day, I went back home and uploaded some photos that I'd taken earlier. I posted them on Instagram when I got a message from Alia. She asked about a specific picture of this cathedral that I'd stumbled upon earlier that day. "When were you at that building?" she asked. It was around noon, so I told her that. She sent back a text with hysteric laughter emojis and told me that had I walked on the other side of that building, I would have run right into her. Apparently, she'd been in a job interview and was just on the other side of that building right when I had been there. I couldn't believe it. I had hoped that maybe this would be enough to get her to meet me. Before this, she had no intention of meeting face to face. She actually gave me the challenge to find her in hopes that I'd get bored and give up. But after this happened, she added to the challenge. "Alright," she said, "if you can do something to impress me, or you can find me in the city, I will meet up with you." I now had something more to work with. Later that week, I had to travel to a city called Dalat. It's a 6-hour bus ride from Ho Chi Minh City, and my friends and I were traveling there for an engagement party. It was amazing. The food was incredible, the people were so happy, and they even gave me a ceremonial rice drink. Tradition states that if I were to drink this in front of the family, I would from that day forth be considered a part of that family. I was honored, and I drank it in one gulp with pride. I got so drunk during this party. Vietnamese alcohol is like water. You barely even taste it, and I remember passing my camera around to my new Vietnamese family members as they snapped photos willy-nilly. They even messed with my camera settings, and it took me a long time to get them set back up again. On our way back from Dalat, I remembered Alia. I whipped out my phone and I sent her a message. I was wondering what she'd been up to, and I wanted to share my stories with her. I was smitten with this girl. This was the only girl who wasn't instantly taken by the fact that I was a pink-skinned foreigner. She treated herself with dignity, and I admired her personality a lot. I asked her what she'd been up to over the past week, and what she said shocked me. Alia had coincidentally traveled to Dalat as well. She'd been doing a photo shoot with one of her friends, and they decided to travel to that city to take pictures with a bunch of flowers, as Dalat is known as the Flower City. I was dumbfounded. First the cathedral, and now it turns out we've been in the same place at the same time once again? Things were getting weird for me, and as soon as I got back to Ho Chi Minh City, I knew I needed to find a way to impress this girl, so that I could meet her. For the next 20 days, I worked on this art piece. Alia loved art, and I knew if I did something artistic, she could be impressed by that. I took all of her Instagram photos and made a photo mosaic of my favorite picture that was on her Instagram. It was a photo of her standing in a field of flowers. The top of her head was cut out of the photo and just her nose down to her shoes was visible. I'm probably not describing that well, but it was a beautiful picture. Once my photo mosaic was done, I sent it over to her and awaited her reply. She was blown away. She had no idea that a tech nerd could be so artistic, and this was enough to impress her. She finally agreed to meet me. Another funny coincidence was I managed to impress her one day before my birthday. She happened to have the next day off, so I was going to be able to spend my birthday with her. When that day came, I was so nervous I didn't eat anything. I hadn't eaten the whole day. I was so busy getting ready to meet her and I wanted to make a good impression. She sent me a text with the address to a street in Vietnam. We were supposed to go on a date there, but it took me so long to find it that I ended up being late. Luckily, her taxi driver was also running late, so we ended up arriving at the same time anyway. We had about 15 minutes to get to know each other before my friends sent me a text. They told me that they'd be going out to a pizza place and then for some karaoke after. So instead of finally eating, we all met up at a cafe. This is when I made a huge mistake. When we stopped at the cafe, I ordered a drink. It was an iced Oreo Frappuccino, and as delicious as it was, drinking that much coffee and that much sugar on an empty stomach messed me up big time. We made it to the pizza place, and I started getting sick. I went to the bathroom so many times, throwing up. I couldn't even eat because of how I'd mistreated my body. I felt so bad. There I was, finally on a date with Alia, and most of my time was spent dying in the bathroom or lying down on a bench because of that damn Frappuccino. So there I am, laying on a dirty Vietnamese bathroom floor when Alia walks into the men's room and sits down next to me. "What are you doing?" she exclaims. "You're going to catch a disease down here. Come with me, okay?" She takes me by the hand and led me to a seat where her and I could be alone. She made me eat a piece of pizza, and in hindsight, that was probably the best thing I could have done for myself. The issue was I'd starved myself all day in anticipation of this date and then drank coffee at 6 p.m. My poor stomach needed something to balance me out. After I ate, I felt a little better, and it was now time to go to karaoke. I sat down for a while until Alia got up and sang. I couldn't believe how much control she had over her voice. She could really sing, and after she was done, she turned around and had me stand up. I don't know if I can sing, Alia. I might still be sick." "Nonsense," she replied as she looked into my eyes. "If you sing, you'll feel better." I smiled at her as she picked a song from High School Musical. I think we sang Breaking Free, if I recall correctly. And she was right. The adrenaline of singing up on stage knocked me out of my sickness. I felt a lot better. After that night, Alia had to go home, but I asked her if I'd earned a redo. I wanted one more chance to truly show her who I was, and she smiled and agreed. The next day, we traveled all around the city. She showed me all kinds of places that I hadn't gotten to see yet. In the evening, we went to a huge park, the most beautiful park in Vietnam that overlooks the tallest building. It's called Landmark 81, and apparently it's the 44th tallest building in the world. At least, that's what the Vietnamese tell me. We walked around the park for a while as we got to know each other. It was around midnight, and she told me that she never walked around her city this late at night. She went to bed at 10 p.m. every day on the dot, and nobody was ever able to change that, not even her best friends. Eventually, we made our way into the city and started walking down the river. We stopped at a bench, and I looked into her eyes. I was nervous, but I said, "Just a hypothetical question. Would you be mad if I kissed you?" She looked back at me and said, "Barry, don't you remember the deal we made on Tinder?" I was confused. I hadn't remembered any deal. She laughed a little and said, "I told you that if you were able to find me in the city, you would be allowed to kiss me." I was filled with butterflies, and without any hesitation, I leaned in for the mushy-gushy part of the story. It was about 2:30 a.m. when Alia and I decided to return to my hotel. She was worried about driving that late at night, so she told me she would stay with me and watch me sleep, since I had insomnia. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ooh, this is gonna get juicy, but to be completely honest, nothing happened. I mean, I kissed her like a madman, but beyond that, I respected her, and I wanted her to feel safe with me. If there weren't already enough funny coincidences between us, it turned out that where I'd been staying was only a 3-minute walk from where she lived. Ailey and I had been minutes from each other the entire time I was living in Vietnam. She stayed with me all that night, and the next day, she took me all over her city again. She showed me where she grew up, took me for meals that I hadn't even tried yet in Vietnam, and we even went to her favorite milk tea place. I loved it. It was around 7 o'clock when my friend that I'd traveled with called me. He told me that our flight had been moved up, so instead of leaving at noon the next day, we now had to leave at 12 o'clock that night. I looked at Alia with sad eyes and I told her the news. We thought we'd have another whole day together, but it turned out these were going to be our last moments. We had to cut our adventure short. We were hours away from Ho Chi Minh and it was already getting late. The entire time I rode on the back of her bike, I was thinking about her. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I couldn't stay either. I didn't know if I was ever going to see her again, and that thought pained me. I'd been in Vietnam for a month and a half. I met Alia on Tinder in the first 2 weeks, and I'd only got to spend 2.5 days with her before I had to go. It didn't feel like enough time. She took me back to my apartment and helped me pack. I got ready as fast as possible so I could have time to be with her for as long as I could. We kissed each other passionately, knowing that this was the last time we were ever going to see one another. Eventually, my friends came and knocked on my door. When I opened it up, my hair was a mess, and they both stopped and looked at me. "What were you guys doing?" they asked, and I nervously screamed, "I was brushing my hair!" Alia was dying, and of course, my friends didn't believe me. We got a taxi, and Alia rode to the airport with us. I hugged her the whole time as we waited for our luggage to be brought inside. The last thing I remember as I walked away was Alia's eyes. She's a strong person, and I knew she didn't want me to see her in pain, but I could see the sadness in the glimmer of her eyes as they watered up. A few weeks later, back in Oregon, I was over at my friend's house again. We had the place all to ourselves and we decided to trip on mushrooms. As I came up, I felt my heart being filled with love. I walked into a room to be alone, and as I stared up at the ceiling, it looked as though there were little people up there. They were half heart shapes, and as I watched them come together in a hug, they formed a full heart together. I started crying, and my only thought was Alia, how much I missed her, and what I would give just to see her again. I would try to send her messages, but the time difference made things hard, and I'd never really been the best at replying. This bothered her, and eventually we cut contact. Then one day, I got an email. The email contained 3 pictures. Hidden within the photos were clues to her location in America. See, she planned to come to America one day and pursue a degree in business. After that, she would go to school for fashion design, and if I could crack the code from these images, I'd be able to find out which state she'd be living in and how to find her. It took me a few weeks to figure this out. She's a clever girl, but after some time and help from my friends, I was finally able to crack the code. She told me that she would wait for me, and the second that she was in America, I could come visit her. But fate had other plans. 6 months after I'd visited Vietnam, I started feeling stuck again. There I'd been in this perfect little paradise with all these amazing things to see and a girl that I'd fallen in love with, and now I was back home, living in the same old rut that I'd been living before. I knew it was time for a change, and my life had been taking a very large turn anyway. Months before I'd even gone to Vietnam in the first place, I had an experience with a psychedelic, and it completely changed my life. I saw the world in a way that I'd never thought possible, and I'd become obsessed with understanding everything that life had to offer. I knew I wanted to study psychedelics, and when I say that, I don't mean I wanted to go somewhere that I could be safe and trip all the time. I wanted to set up a lab in a country that had no laws surrounding the compounds. My idea was simple. Take people from all walks of life and have them share their experiences on camera. I could take groups of Christians, and if they agreed, I'd give them a psychedelic. I'd trip sit them and make sure they were comfortable and in a safe mindset. After their experience, I would ask them how they felt about God and if their ideas surrounding life or spirituality had changed. I would then do the same with groups of atheists, and after researching a bunch of different countries for a few weeks, I realized that Vietnam had no written laws surrounding psychedelic compounds. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Not only could I finally return to this little paradise, but I'd be researching something that I was passionate about, and I could finally go see Alia again. But I needed to prepare. I went to a few friends and asked them if they wanted to go with me, if they'd like to be my camera crew and help me with my research. Most of them said no. There was this one guy that I barely knew. I worked with him at a computer shop, and he happened to be there one day when I was asking a friend of mine if he wanted to go with me. The offer ended up being extended to him, and a few days later, he was fired from his job and decided to take me up on said offer. There was one condition. His girlfriend would have to go as well. I agreed, and in less than a month, we were ready to go. I emailed Alia telling her what was happening. I asked her if I'd need to complete yet another test in order to meet her again in Vietnam. She told me that I had already completed my tests for her country. So long as we're in Vietnam, I will help you, she said. My heart almost couldn't contain it. We arrived in Vietnam after the grueling 18-hour flight with another goddamn layover in China. I seriously can't tell you how much I hate the Chinese airport. As I exited the airport in Vietnam, I instantly remembered everything. It was as though I'd left a part of my mind in that place, and as soon as I stepped on Vietnamese land, it returned to me. The sights, the sounds, the smells, and especially the heat. It was so hot instantly. And I knew I'd get used to it as I had before, but I still felt the need to get a haircut as soon as possible. Alia met me at the airport. I gave her the biggest hug and we laughed together when she stopped and asked me where I was going to be staying. Staying? I hadn't reserved a place yet. I figured I'd get a place once I got here, I replied. She looked back at me with shock. She laughed so hard at me. How could you not reserve a place, Barry? Do you want to be out on the street? She sat down and looked for about an hour before booking us a place in the city. We were there for the first 5 days, and I spent that time looking like crazy for an apartment. All the apartments were either too expensive or not big enough to fit all of us, and after multiple failures, Alia took control of that project as well and found us a place in just a few hours. I was so embarrassed, but I was also so thankful to have her helping me. When we finally got to our apartment and signed the papers, I took Alia and started dancing with her. I was singing Isn't She Lovely by Stevie Wonder. It didn't take too long though before things started going sour. See, I'd planned to go to Vietnam to start a channel about psychedelic research, and once I started to focus on that research, I realized that though Vietnam has no laws about psychs, their justice system isn't the most complete or fair. Here's the deal. If I was caught documenting psychedelics, the government would then have two options. Either they ship me out of the country and I'm never allowed to return, or they could keep me in prison for as long as they wanted without allowing me contact to my friends or family until they decided to cut my head off. I probably don't have to tell you how unappealing those options sound, and now I felt stuck. A similar kind of feeling that I had when I was home, but this was a different kind of stuck. I'd never been in a foreign country with this much responsibility before. I'd taken 2 people with me with no way of supporting them, and we were going to be there for a long time without any form of income. I'd also been dealing with culture shock. 30% of the people in Ho Chi Minh City can speak English, and even less than that are fluent enough to genuinely understand you. They can mostly say, "Hello, welcome to Vietnam. Are you from California?" Or, "Come into my shop, I make good deal for you." I'd never felt so alone, and I was around more people than I'd ever seen in my life. Not only that, but I was homesick. I missed my family, I missed my friends, and I rarely got time to speak with them due to the time zone. I think the worst part, however, was the responsibility I'd felt for my friends that I'd taken out there. Mentally, these 2 were young. The guy I brought fought me to tedium about getting a job. See, I tried to set him up as an English teacher, since teaching English as a foreigner makes the most amount of money in Vietnam, and you don't necessarily have to have any credentials to get into the practice. He would tell me, I came here to be a cameraman, not a teacher. He wouldn't budge on that either. I tried to tell him that I didn't feel right putting him and his fiancée at risk over this video series that I wanted to make, but he was stubborn. I started falling into a pit of depression, which I'd never experienced before in my life. I mean, I've been sad, I'd had my down times, but never like this. I'd wake up and my chest would feel tight. I'd get one real full breath of air right when I woke up, and then after that, it would feel as though someone had wrapped their arms around me so tightly that I couldn't breathe normally. Beyond that, things would stick to me. Little things throughout the day that normally would bounce off me would now send me into panic attacks. I had no idea what was going on with me. But Alia was always there trying to help me out. She even started teaching me how to ride motorbikes so I could drive her around the city instead. The second time she took me out though, I had a panic attack in the middle of my lesson. I had driven down that very road before. There had even been fewer people driving down this time, but for some reason I felt so afraid. I thought we were going to die and that I was losing control of the bike. Alia decided that it was time for a vacation. I'd been in Vietnam for about a month, and we hadn't yet left this city. So I told my friends that I'd be leaving, and Alia and I packed our bags to head to Dalat. Now, Dalat is a beautiful city. It reminded me of Oregon, if Oregon was also a jungle forest. Dalat is home to the largest love gardens in Vietnam. There are flowers everywhere, and I'd visited Dalat the first time I was in this country. That's actually where I'd been indoctrinated into that family for drinking the rice drink. Alia and I got off the bus in Dalat and found ourselves a cute little B&B outside the city. It was quaint. A little white house with a blue trim, a nice little cat inside, and we even got ourselves an upstairs room overlooking the jungle and some construction work, of course. The Vietnamese are always doing construction around the city. Alia drove us around the whole time we were there since I was only a beginner, and Dalat was a bit more dangerous than Ho Chi Minh City since the streets are more rural and people drove a little more recklessly. Alia and I were going through some trouble while we were in Dalat. We argued and fought about things that I can't even remember now. I was miserable and I was putting it on her. The funny thing is, Dalat has this curse attached to it. See, Dalat's a place where couples go. It's the love capital of Vietnam. And the curse is simple. If you take your significant other to Dalat, you will break up before you leave. If you take your wife or husband to this beautiful city, you will get divorced after you return. I didn't know about this curse until after we got back, but things between Alia and I started getting difficult. So much so that we went to a cafe one night and started talking about breaking up. We decided to enjoy the rest of our time in Dalat as boyfriend and girlfriend, and then once we got back, we break up and go our separate ways. The next day, Alia and I rented a bike from the B&B and took it out into the countryside. It was beautiful. There were farms everywhere. I felt like I was back home in a way. We even stopped the bike a few times and walked through the valleys, which I was not expecting. The Vietnamese don't care at all if you're on their property. They don't think possessively about the world, and I love that kind of humility. After our walk, we got back on the bike and realized that it wouldn't start. I tried everything, but the bike was acting like it was dead. I looked up at Alia and said those fated last words. Well, this can't get any worse. Not 3 minutes later, it started raining, and it was raining hard. I pushed the motorbike for 2 hours in the rain until we got to a little village and pushed it into a mechanic shop. The mechanic told us that the bike would need a new battery and that the fix wouldn't take much more than 40 minutes. We sat in that shop for another 2.5 hours while the mechanic got to other people first. I started to notice that as people would come into the shop, he would work for them and then get back to our bike. I asked Alia why he was doing that, and after she talked to him, she told me that because I'm a white guy, my skin was drawing business to his shop. So he was milking it while it lasted. I guess the logic is, if a white guy trusts this mechanic, then he must be a good mechanic. And as other Vietnamese saw this, they wanted his expertise because I trusted him. What a strange culture. After 2.5 hours, he finally put in a new battery, something that would have taken just milliseconds to do, and we were on our way. We had to give him 600,000 Vietnam dong, which equates to roughly $24. Kind of amazing how cheap everything is over there. I'm almost ashamed to admit how much I missed that aspect of Vietnam. It was now around 6 o'clock, and it was time to head back to Dalat to get some food. We stopped over at this little cafe, which was still quite a ways out of Dalat City. Admittedly, we stopped because I had to go pee. When I got back to the bike, it wouldn't start again, and the rain also decided to start up even harder than it had been before. We pushed the bike down the hill to this little cafe, and soaking wet, we ordered some tea and food. Alia and I huddled together under some blankets, and though we were in a bad place in our relationship, this night made us remember each other in a way that we'd forgotten. We remembered how nice it was to be with each other, to hold one another. Things were still rough, but we were both a little happier to have each other's company. We must have spent another 2 hours in this coffee shop when it was about to close. Alia told a Vietnamese kid about our situation, and he said he might know how to fix it. He got on the bike, put the kickstand up, and it started no problem. Apparently, this particular brand of bike is built specifically so that if you try to start the bike while the kickstand's down, it won't turn on. Meaning, we replaced the battery for no reason, and the bike had been fine the entire time we walked it through the rain. The next day, Alia and I fought. We decided to go to an underground mall in Dalat, which is a beautiful place to have such a rough argument. I wanted her to understand me, and she wanted the same, but it was hard for us to communicate properly. Don't get me wrong, she understands and speaks English very well, but some things were hard to communicate. After hours of fighting, I started to cry. I broke down right in front of her. She stopped and looked at me with a comforting expression, and I told her everything. I told her how I felt like a failure, how my plans for Vietnam had fallen to pieces. I told her about the struggles that I'd been having with my friends that came with me, and how I felt responsible for them even though they'd been making life hard on me. I told her I missed my family, and I was scared for my future. I was losing a lot of money taking care of everyone out there, and I felt trapped and alone while I wandered through the city. Only then did she finally understand that I wasn't mad at her. I'd been in a terrible mindset, and though I'd been taking it out on her, it had never been her fault. I developed a fear of being misunderstood because of the language barrier all around me, and even that I'd been taking out on her. Later that evening, I went out alone. I went to a night market and bought Alia a keychain. It was a little cactus globe with sparkles and snow in it, and it had hearts around the pot that the cactus was sitting in. While Alia took a shower, I hid the cactus in her boot. I invited her for a walk, and when she went to put her shoes on, she found the gift. I told her I loved her, and that I was sorry for everything I'd put her through. We decided then that we would help each other. She could be strong where I was weak and help me in her country, and when she needed me, I would be there for her. Alia and I finally got back to Ho Chi Minh City, and we told my friends about the trip. They told me that they also had news. They would be leaving Vietnam soon and heading back to America. It turned out that they'd run out of money, which I knew since I lent them $2,500 so they could live and eat. They told me they would return home, get a job, and find a way to pay me back for everything I did. It was kind of a bittersweet thing. I was happy that I no longer had to worry about them. I no longer had to lend them money or transfer money out of my accounts that their family had sent me. I was happy that I was finally going to have my own space and my privacy again, since that was another thing that I'd lost while I'd been living with them for these 2 months. But I was also sad. I had a lot of regret for the way that I'd treated them. I was angry at my friend for not trying to help me out in Vietnam. He was going through his own struggles, and I was so upset at him that I never even considered his and his girlfriend's position. As much as I let them down, though, I was happy, and I decided to give them my place for the rest of the time that they'd spend in Vietnam. Ailey and I spent some time looking for apartments. There was one in the city that I really wanted, but the guy who was renting it was a complete weasel, so we decided against it. Took us a couple weeks, but we finally found a place that I liked. It was small but very reasonably priced, and the landlady was so sweet I couldn't say no. The only problem was she wanted me to sign a year contract, and I'd already purchased a plane ticket back to the US. I only had 3 more months left in Vietnam before I would return home. However, I signed the contract anyway and told her that I'd stay for the year. My plan was simple. When I finally did need to leave, I could sell my lease to someone else and tell the landlady that some very important family business came up and that I had to leave in a hurry to resolve it. Just like that, I had a new place all to myself and things were looking up. For the most part. I was heavily depressed for 2.5 months when I was living in Vietnam. The culture shock, the failed plans, the guilt I felt for putting my friends in this situation, the money I'd been losing, the struggling relationship, not being able to hang out with my family and friends, and not having anyone in my life that could understand me the way my mind required. All of this weighed on me very heavily, and I still suffered from anxiety attacks. I felt like I couldn't breathe a full breath of air throughout my whole day. My vision would expand in this really strange way when these anxiety attacks would happen. I told myself that it was because my fight or flight response had activated, and I was being put in a higher state of visual awareness, some primal survival instinct or something. I didn't know how to heal myself. I tried looking for therapy, but it doesn't really exist yet in Vietnam, and the therapists that are out there are either too swamped with clients, or they're far too expensive. I did, however, have a band-aid for my pain. There are these bars in Vietnam along the party district. This particular strip is where everything is permitted. Gambling, drugs, prostitution, anything you want, they've got it. And it's all legal only on this one strip in Vietnam. Well, in these bars, they would sell laughing gas and these giant balloons, and I would go to these bars and puff on the gas, so I could feel happy for a moment. I started doing this about a month after I got to Vietnam. First, it was once or twice a week, then it was every other day, and pretty soon it was every night. I'd go to the party district and puff on these balloons until I couldn't do it anymore, and then I would take a taxi home. I hid this from everyone. Even Alia didn't know for a while. Eventually I did tell her, and I even promised not to go to those bars anymore, but I never actually kept my word. One night I went there. I was heavily depressed, and these 2 Norwegian guys sat down beside me and started up a friendly conversation. They asked me how long I'd been in Vietnam and how I liked it there. There I am, sitting in a bar with a big-ass balloon in one hand and a joint in the other when I looked back at them and said, well, I'm depressed. They laughed and said, "Yeah, you know what? We can tell." One of them asked me what I was puffing on in the balloon, and I told him it was nitrous oxide. He seemed confused, so I handed it over to him and told him to take a puff. He took a few puffs and completely disappeared into his head. I watched this guy just go away, and I felt like a complete idiot for doing that to myself. Is this what I look like? I thought to myself. Just then, the other guy gets a call from his boss and tries to get his friend's attention. I take the balloon back and started puffing on it, when I noticed this guy started picking his friend up. He had so much concern on his face, and he looked over at me before he left and said with fear in his voice, "This is my brother." Instantly, I was thrown into what I can only call the worst trip I've ever had. I imagined my brother and I walking down the party district in Vietnam. I imagined some guy giving nitrous oxide to him and messing him up forever, and how much I hated that guy for doing that to my flesh and blood. I put all of that guilt onto myself, and that, compounded with everything else that I was already going through, broke me. The nitrous terrified me in a way that I'll never forget. Other than that trip, I no longer felt my body. Nitrous oxide is a numbing agent, and I couldn't even tell if I was still breathing. Then there was the complete blackness. My vision had left me. I may have even passed out. Everything was dark, and I thought that I'd gone blind. Nitrous oxide can cause blindness in people, and though I knew that, I was so addicted to feeling happy again, I didn't care. It felt like I was lost in this dreadful place for an eternity. Moments later, I started feeling my body again. I was shaking. Cold sweat was running down my face, and I had my head down on the table in front of me. My vision slowly came back, but I was in a state of fear and confusion. Slowly, I let the balloon leak the gas. When it was finally out, I walked down the street and headed home. I hadn't realized how severely I'd messed myself up. I had been traumatized by this experience, and I even had triggers that would send me into very intense panic attacks. They seemed so random at first. I'd start shaking and crying, and I couldn't even speak when they'd hit me. It took me a long time to realize what these triggers were. If I smelled latex, I'd be shot into this terrifying state. It was a trigger from the balloon. If I smelled cigarettes, it would also send me into a panic attack. The party district is filled with the smell of cigarettes, but all of Vietnam smells like that too. I also noticed anything that changed my perception would cause an attack. If I drank coffee, if I smoked weed, these ones were the worst since I'd have to wait there for the coffee or weed to exit my system before I returned to normal. I'd have to endure this terrifying mindset until then. I wasn't myself anymore. I'd wake up unable to breathe, feeling depressed and anxious. I'd go out into the city, and if anything bad happened to me, it would stick with me throughout the day. There were times where I'd be hanging out with my friends. I'd take them back to my apartment, I'd go to unlock the door, and my hands would start shaking. I'd start to cry for no reason, and they would tell me, "Stop messing around." They thought I was playing with them, until I'd look up and their faces began to mimic mine. I felt so bad for making them feel that way. They were worried about me, and they'd ask me what was wrong. The worst part was, I couldn't tell them. I didn't understand what had happened to me, and whenever I tried to explain it, it was like my brain shut off. Mind you, all of this happened before Ayla and I went to Dalat. I'd been in Vietnam for about a month and a half when this party district fiasco went down. I'd laughed about it. How could I get traumatized by a balloon? How weak am I? And even funnier still, how ironic is it that I, as an American, came to Vietnam and got PTSD? There was a joke being played on me, and though it was funny in the moment, I spent almost 3 months in this debilitating state of mind. As all this went on, I would call my family and tell them how it happened. I would call my friends and tell them about it, and I even went to Ayla and told her that I might be able to cure myself. See, I'd been researching psychedelics and their effects on mental health for almost 3 years by that point. I'd read about their effects on PTSD, depression, anxiety, and addiction, which were all things I've been suffering from. I believed in psychedelic compounds, and I'd even taken them before. I knew I'd be okay, and I would have done anything to exit this hell that I was living in. But my family, my friends, and my girlfriend all said the same thing. "Barry, a drug did this to you. You can't fix it by using another one." I know their intentions were pure. They were afraid for me, and I was so afraid I didn't trust myself anymore. I started telling myself that they were right, and nothing was going to work. If I was going to get through this, I would have to do it myself. Weeks passed, and Ayla and I would break up and get back together, mostly because of these sporadic anxiety attacks that I'd have. I'd take all my burdens and put them on her, treat her improperly, and make her feel like I didn't care and nothing mattered. As I'd walk down the streets of Ho Chi Minh City, I would think about throwing myself into traffic to make it stop. How easy would it be to order a taxi bike, and while we're flying down the highway, just jump off and get run over until I die? These thoughts were comforting to me, and when I realized that, I knew I couldn't let this persist any longer. I didn't care if a psychedelic messed me up even more. I knew nothing could be worse than how I was feeling, and I told myself that I came to Vietnam to research the mental health benefits of these compounds. I needed to trust myself if I was going to get through this. A few days later, I went to a bar around my district. I met some Americans, and I asked them if they knew anyone in the area who sold psychedelics. One of them gave me the number for a woman who sold LSD, and told me that he'd taken it before and had a great time. I sent a message to the number and purchased a couple tabs of LSD. When they finally arrived, I took a tab and went out into the city. As I walked through the streets of Vietnam, I started to feel myself coming up on the compound. I became terrified and hyper-aware. I started seeing all of my fears, my failures, my guilt, and anxiety all around me. It was as though they were truly happening right in front of me. As I looked at them, they would grow stronger and larger. Eventually, the fear became so overwhelming that I broke out into laughter. I must have looked like a madman laughing to myself in the streets of Vietnam. My fears had become so immense that they were hysterical. I realized in that moment that all the power these fears had was power I had given to them. "Come at me," I would say out loud. "If you want to hurt me, come get it done." It was incredible how lost I had been. These worries and fears were nothing more than my mind being evil to me. It was self-deprecation. I was fabricating a reality of hell that didn't even exist in the first place. And it felt like this was the first moment I truly looked around and saw the paradise that I was living in. Vietnam was beautiful. I had a girlfriend who cared about me. And as for all the money that I was hemorrhaging, who gives a shit? It's money. I was laughing to myself throughout the entire walk. When I got back to my apartment, Alia was there. She was asking how I felt and how I'd been doing when I looked at her and smiled. I pulled open my closet, which had a mirror in it, and I shouted at myself, "Hey, I know you! I haven't seen you in so long, and I missed you so much!" I spent a lot of time yelling at myself in the mirror as Alia sat on the bed and laughed at me. She thought I was going crazy, but little did she know I'd finally found my sanity. I had my mind back. I remember one thing I was screaming to myself. I said, "Oh, Barry, you poor thing. You're so sad and lonely, so here's your big idea. Go to the party district and get high off your ass every night? Really? If you're so lonely, go out into the city and find some friends, you idiot. You got addicted to the balloon and you made excuses to continue using it." I smiled at myself and said, "You're better than that. It's good to see you again." Things got a lot better from that moment forward. I no longer had any triggers. The smell of latex or cigarettes had no effect on me at all. Sad moments of the day bounced off me like bullets on Superman. I held my head high, and I took Ilya out more. We'd go to the War Museum or go to the top floor of the tallest building in Ho Chi Minh City, Landmark 81. Eventually, Ilya introduced me to her friends, and we had a great time. After a few weeks of having my mind back, Ilya invited me to go to Nha Trang with her and her friends. During that trip, Ilya and I went through some trouble. I'd been selfish, and I'd said some things that made her feel like I didn't care about her. I wasn't trying to be hurtful, but it caused a big fight between us. After a few hours of arguing and talking, we decided to break up. This time, it would be for real. We decided to finish the trip in Nha Trang. After that, we would go back to Dalat and spend a week there, and once we were back in Ho Chi Minh, that would be it. This was kind of rough for me, but it felt like it was the right call. We'd been on again, off again so many times that it felt like we were trying to force what we knew didn't work. We went to the beach that night and swam in the ocean. Nha Trang is kind of like Ho Chi Minh City, except you've got a beach on the edge of town. I kind of like that more, besides all the towering Russian people around. It's weird how you can get used to being the tallest guy in the country, surrounded by little Asian people, and then you get around a bunch of Russians and you start to understand how the Vietnamese feel. After we had our time in Nha Trang, Ailey and I took our last trip to Dalat before heading back to Ho Chi Minh City. This would be our last trip together, so we wanted to make it special. Do all the things we never had done in Dalat. See all the things that we hadn't been able to see yet. We went to some cool museums and parks, but I just couldn't pay attention. I knew what was going to happen between us was the right call, but it was still very painful being close to her and getting along like we were. The bus ride home was the hardest part. I was counting down the hours before I'd never see her again. I was torn about this breakup. See, Alia wasn't perfect. She got mad at me over things that I didn't think were that big of a deal. She'd get upset because I was bad at replying to texts. I would send her a message sometime through the day, and it would be a while before I replied to her messages because I was so immersed in the adventures that I was in. This made her feel like I didn't give her the attention she deserved, and we fought about this the most. I knew I wasn't perfect, and I would say things that bothered her and made her feel like I didn't care about her. But things like this made me a bit relieved. Now we no longer could hurt each other, but I was torn because of everything she had done. She helped me so much in Vietnam. Without her, I never would have gotten the places that I've been living comfortably in. I never would have learned to ride the motorbike as fast as I did. She showed me all the nicest places to go for meals, taught me how to use the food and taxi apps, and how to optimize my shopping and haggling. I felt like I owed her so much for what she'd done for me, and here I was on this bus with only a couple hours left before I'd never be able to see her again. Ayla and I exited the bus and were now back home. I hugged her and told her goodbye. I watched as she drove away on her bike. It was something out of a K-drama, if I'm being completely honest. The next day, I wandered around the city aimlessly. As I mentioned before, I'd purchased a plane ticket so I could fly back to America, but I still had almost 2 months left in Vietnam, and I felt as aimless as my direction. Everything I had seen and done up to this point was mostly because I had Alia there to help guide me. I mean, I'd throw myself into the city and get lost very often. I'd go to the party district, find a bar, meet people. I had a couple friends that I'd met randomly out in Vietnam. One was a documentary filmmaker who was working on a film about Vietnamese rock and roll bands, and the other was an actor from Japan. I also had 3 friends who I'd met the first time I traveled to Vietnam, and I loved hanging out with all of them. I just didn't know what to do. I still didn't have a job. I no longer had any roommates. I had finally cured my depression and gotten my mind back, but in the process, I'd lost one of the most important reasons I'd come to Vietnam. Alia. The next day, I woke up and decided to stay inside. I didn't want to go out into the city as everything I saw reminded me of her. You know that pansy-ass state of mind you get into after a breakup? Well, I was plagued by that. I spent most of the day inside. It was about 3 p.m. and I was doing some writing when I got this overpowering urge to go out into the city. I fought the feeling at first, and I looked out the window. As I stared at the street, something told me that I needed to go out and enjoy the day. So I put on my shoes and I went for a walk. There I am, walking down the street, when all of a sudden I feel a familiar presence. It was like someone I knew was standing right next to me. I turned around, and who of all people happened to be standing right there? I watched as Alia turned around and looked right up at me, tears in her eyes and a look of shock on her face. She said my name. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I was so taken aback I actually couldn't speak for a moment. Finally, I'd composed myself and told her that I decided to go on a walk. This is when she told me how bizarre this situation was. Alia had just gone to lunch with her friend. She was miserable about the breakup and needed someone to talk to. After the lunch, her friend took her back to her apartment, a place that I wasn't aware of. Before that very moment, I didn't know where Alia lived. Alia got off the bike and was just about to open her door when she got a feeling that I was standing right behind her. She specifically said it felt like I was there. When she turned around, there we were, standing face to face in a city of over 8 million people. The odds of this had to be astronomical, and I genuinely started laughing because I couldn't believe it had happened. We just kind of sat there for a few moments looking at each other. Neither of us knew what to say, but eventually we decided to get some food together and talk. It felt like a movie. It felt like something was telling us that our time together wasn't over yet. We'd tried breaking up before and we never actually committed to it. Then when we finally did break up for good and went our separate ways, only 1 day passed before we're coincidentally placed right in front of one another. We decided that we needed to figure out what our issues were. Why was it so hard to understand each other? Yeah, there was a language barrier, but I wasn't sure if she was being genuine to me or if she was trying to control me, and she had no idea if I really cared about her. When I was in the city, I was lost to astonishment. I'd go out often and just enjoy the adventures I was thrown into. People would stop me in the city and ask me to do something for them, and it would lead me to a whole new place that I'd never seen before. I felt like I was collecting GTA-style side missions, and there were so many of these encounters that I'd have to write them down. Otherwise, I'd forget them because of how much would happen to me in just 1 day. I went from living in a tiny little town where nothing happened to living in a city where doing nothing and being lazy is not an option. You go out for food and you accidentally run into adventures, and I promise you, if you do not write them down, you'll forget them. It's like a month of life packed into 1 day, and every day was like that. Because of how swept away I was, I wouldn't be texting Alia. I was too immersed in this wonderfully exciting world, and she didn't understand that. This place was her home. This chaotic way of life was all she knew, and she didn't understand how I never had any time to check up on her, which led her to believe that I didn't care about her. Alia was a straight person. I'm not talking about her sexual preferences here. When I say straight, I mean she was a 23-year-old who had never done anything her culture considered wrong. She never had sex, she never smoked weed or even a cigarette, never drank alcohol, though she had tried it once, and the idea of taking a psychedelic was like taking meth or heroin to her culture. She never would have in her life thought about taking a drug as an innocent action. After all the events that happened to us, after everything that brought us together, she told me she wanted to understand my world. She said the one thing we lacked was the ability to see through each other's eyes, and she'd hoped that as we spent time together, maybe we'd be able to. But it never happened. What she said to me wildly threw me off. I did not expect her to say it. She said, "Barry, I want to understand your world. If we're going to be together, I have to understand you." This is when she looked up into my eyes and said, "Do you have any more of that LSD?" I replied curiously, "Yeah, I have one tab left," wondering why she'd asked me that. She kept eye contact and said, "I want to try the LSD. This is our last chance. I have a feeling that the LSD can let me into your mind. I have to know if I mean anything to you, if you care about me, and as you've been talking about psychedelics, you told me that they can help people understand things clearer." I was blown away. I have to admit, part of me was excited, but I also knew that psychedelics react differently to different people. I wasn't sure if this was a good idea, and I warned her. "Are you sure you want to do this, Alia?" I asked. "I can't let you do this if you're only going to do it because you think I want you to." She looked back at me and said, "Barry, nobody can force me to do anything. If I don't want to do something, I will say no. You've told me a lot about psychedelics, and in my spare time, I've been doing my own research. I want to try this. Best case, it shows me your world. Shows me what you mean when you talk about them, and worst case, it shows me nothing, and at least we gave this a final chance." Her answer satisfied me. I never wanted anyone to try psychedelics because I had. All I ever wanted was to share my stories with people because these experiences were very meaningful to me. I told Alia that I'd be there for her the whole time to make sure she was safe, and a couple days later, she took the LSD. Her come-up was very interesting. She was in my apartment while it happened, and I saw this massive smile on her face. She laughed a lot and said, "It's weird. I feel normal, but I can't stop smiling." I laughed when she said that. A few hours later, she started crying. I asked her if she felt sad, and she told me that she felt a lot of pressure from her culture. She said that in her country, you have to be rigid and strong. You cannot make mistakes. She said her parents had been very hard on her because they wanted her to succeed, but that this had been very tough for her. The pressure had built up into crying, and I held her as she did. The experience seemed very healing for her, and I asked if she wanted to go for a walk down by the water. She agreed, and away we went. As we continued to walk, she would say things that resonated with me. She said, "I see so many shapes and patterns. I see the world in the most beautiful way." I'd ask her what she meant, and she turned to me to explain it. She said, "The way I see the world right now is the way that we're all supposed to see it. We don't need a psychedelic to see it this way either. The reason we cannot see the world like this is because we're too focused on past, present, and future problems. But if you let those go and just live in the moment, you'll see the world in its purest mathematical form." She was tripping hard, but she was right. Everything she was saying I'd experienced myself, and I was so glad that she was having a good time. There was one point that I'll never forget when her head shot up. She looked straight at me. "Barry," she exclaimed, "I finally see you." I looked back at her and giggled. "Yeah? What do you see, Alia?" She said, "You're like a kid, and not in a bad way. When you say things, you're not trying to hurt anyone. You're not thinking of ways to be manipulative or hurtful. You're just saying how you feel. You're being honest, even if it hurts." I laughed as she continued. "You're also not trying to ignore me or treat me like you don't care. Think of it like a kid. A kid will get so wrapped up in what they're doing that they won't even hear their mother calling for them. It's not that they don't care, they're just too distracted." Alia described me in a way that I never thought to. I truly felt seen, and I was so happy that she realized that. "Are you okay with being in a relationship with a kid like me?" I asked. She said, "Yeah, it's no problem. I was just afraid that you did things because you wanted to hurt me. You didn't return my texts because you didn't care about me. And you didn't show me loving gestures because I didn't mean anything to you. But you're in a new world, and it's overstimulating for you. You're a kid in a wonderland, and that's okay. I see that you care about me, and that's all that I had to know." From that day forward, things were good. Ailey and I worked as a team. We understood each other on a level that we couldn't before, and the rest of the trip was very smooth and loving. For the last month that I was in Vietnam, my family came and visited. My mother would stay for the first 2 weeks, and my brother was going to live with me until I went back home. We would travel together. I showed my family everything I could. I took them to the tallest tower in Vietnam. I took them to Dalat and showed them how similar it was to our home in Oregon, besides the hordes of Asians, of course. My mother bought a fitted Vietnamese dress, and it looked amazing. My mother's a very small person, so she fit into Vietnamese clothes like they were made for her. My family loved Alia. She was so important to them. The way she spoke cracked us up so many times as the accent made her say bad words by mistake sometimes. For example, she'd tell my family that we swam in the ocean and played on the beach, but instead of saying beach, she would say, "Barry and I went to the beach." We died laughing, and Alia was red as a beet. It was 2 weeks before I had to go home, and I was walking through the city at about 8 o'clock p.m. I passed by this bar with a porch attached to it, and two men were sitting outside drinking. They waved me over and told me that they were partying with a larger group inside. We talked for a little bit and they offered me a drink. I accepted and they poured me some beer from their pitcher. After my drink, I continued down the road, and about 30 minutes later, I started to feel strange. It was a familiar feeling, as though I was coming up on mushrooms, but I became terrified. Why do I feel this way, I thought? Did those guys spike my drink with an opiate or amphetamine? As I started coming up, the city smelled like fruit. Music hit me in a way that I'd never felt before, and I was completely in the moment. It almost felt like I was coming up on LSD, but this was an unfamiliar feeling. Waves of euphoria passed over me, and eventually I met a lady who was able to help me out. I told her my symptoms and asked her if I'd be okay, and she replied, "Oh, dude, I'm rolling all the time, don't even worry about it. It sounds like you're on ecstasy." I was so relieved. I went to the party district and danced like I'd never had before. When I went and sat down, a Vietnamese man came up to me and started giving me a massage. I turned around and said I didn't want it. He looked at me and said, "No worry, I give good massage for you, I'm professional." I said no a few times, but he refused to listen to me, and eventually I just let him do it. Vietnamese people will do this on the regular. They'll take your shoes off and start fixing them or coerce you into letting them drive you somewhere into the city, and then they'll ask you for a bunch of money for the service. I knew exactly what this guy was doing. After the massage was over, he poked me on the shoulder. 200,000, he said, indicating to me that he wanted to be paid for his work. Now, 200,000 Vietnam dong is like $8, but I had another idea. I looked at him and said, "Turn around." He looked confused, so I said it louder, "Turn around." He turned around and I started massaging his back when he whipped back toward me and said, "No, no." I shot back and said, "Yeah, I said no and you did it anyway. Turn around." He got pissed off and walked away, and I laughed so hard. Other people in the bar saw it too, and they thought it was hysterical. The last few weeks in Vietnam went by really fast. Every day was bittersweet. On the one hand, I was finally going to be able to go back home and see my family. I could visit my friends again and get back to work, but there was also a large part of me that regretted buying that plane ticket. I'd purchased the ticket while I was depressed. I thought my time in Vietnam was a mistake, and by going home, maybe I'd be okay. Once I was cured of my hellish state of mind, I realized how lucky I had been to live in this country, and honestly, I didn't want to go. Alia and I spent our last few days together watching movies and enjoying our time in the city. Alia only had a couple months left in Vietnam as well before she would have to go to the States and start university. So we took our cameras and went out and filmed the city. We documented everything we could. Anything and everything we were worried that we might forget once we were gone. As I look at the footage, I wish I'd gotten more. I took the camera out into the city a lot, but I mostly just took pictures. If there's one regret I have from Vietnam, it's not taking videos every day. Alia, my brother, and I got a taxi and headed to the airport. These were the last moments that we had in Vietnam. The night before, I'd gotten a hotel room for all of us to stay in, and Alia and I held each other all night. Somehow we knew we were going to see each other again, but it was still so hard to say goodbye. At the airport, Alia and I kissed each other as tears welled up in our eyes. That was the last time that I saw Alia in Vietnam. A few months passed and the same issues from before had surfaced. I wasn't good at keeping contact. We had our own lives and our own things to focus on, so we stopped talking. I did eventually see Alia again when she moved to the US, but this story was about Vietnam. I'll always remember my time there. It was easily the toughest period of my life and also the most magical. I'd never gone through so much in such a short amount of time. Every day felt like a month because of how chaotic and spontaneous it was. The people were so kind and loving, the city was so beautiful, and I loved and lost in this extraordinary place. I have friends who mock me. They say, "Back in Nam" to me, but it always makes me smile. I couldn't have been luckier to have these memories, and I'll never forget the first real girlfriend that I ever had, and the unimaginable events that, just for a moment, allowed us to be part of each other's lives.